Another significant criticism of moral relativism can be summed up as the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem. And essentially, this problem is that moral relativism suffers from being illogical, from not being completely logical. And that's because it seems to derive an ought statement. It seems to derive an ought from an is statement. It derives an ought from an is. And to do that, to derive an ought from an is generally thought to be illogical, not logical. For instance, imagine that I had the belief that the earth was flat. Okay, that is what I believe, that is the case descriptively. Okay, does that in and of itself, does my belief automatically prove that I ought to believe that the earth is flat, or that I ought to live my life as if the earth was flat? Or that that was actually true, that the earth is actually flat just because I believe it? Can I derive what I ought to do and what I ought to believe from what I do and what I do believe? I don't think you would say I can, right? I think we would say it's objectively true that the earth is spherical, that it's round and not flat. And therefore, just because you do descriptively believe something, that in and of itself does not automatically show that you ought to believe that, or that you ought to live your life that way. You cannot derive an ought from an is. You cannot derive a prescriptive statement from a descriptive statement. It's illogical to do so. Similarly, in an ethical circumstance, let's say I had the belief that it was morally permissible to torture little puppies, right? I just love taking their little paws and twisting them in all kinds of unnatural directions and hearing the puppies screech, right? It just brings me such pleasure. Let's just pretend. Don't go passing around the word. I'm pretending, okay? According to relativism, if I do have that belief descriptively, then that establishes the truth of the matter. And because that's true, I also ought to live my life that way. I ought to go around torturing little puppies and hearing them screech just to bring me pleasure. Moral relativism derives an ought, how you ought to live, from an is, the way you do live and what you do believe. But again, in any area of study, that is not logically acceptable. Think back to Hitler, right? It was descriptively true what Hitler believed and what Hitler did. But that does not show that he ought to have done that. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And since that is exactly what moral relativism does, it derives oughts from ises. Moral relativism itself is illogical, and it cannot therefore be a satisfactory moral theory.